Hello and welcome to another episode of Pushing Boundaries, a podcast where we talk about growth and career development by talking to some of the most inspiring people. And my guest today is a seasoned AI practitioner and somebody who has helped businesses unlock the power of AI through practical experimentation and strategic hands-on approach. He creates tailored AI solutions for businesses to allow them to test out new methodologies with their limited budgets and limited teams. His deep expertise and actionable solutions has helped a lot of organizations use AI in their day-to-day businesses. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest today, Hock. Welcome to the podcast, Hock. How are you?
Thanks, Shuchi. I'm very well. How are you?
Great. Good.
Glad to be here.
I'm honored that you decided to join. And it's also the Chinese New Year, so wishing everyone a really happy Chinese New Year. Hopefully the next year will bring a lot of good, positive energy and great news for everyone. So, Hock, you and I have spoken, and I have taken help from you when I was struggling with a couple things on AI. But I'd love to start by learning a little bit about how did you start. So take us through and tell us a little bit about your professional journey.
Yeah, sure. I'm an independent consultant. I started my consulting company in the beginning of 2024. And before that, I was in the telecommunications industry. I did graduate school and I did a PhD in electrical engineering. And after that, I landed a postdoc position at Bell Labs doing research on semiconductor materials and devices. So I also worked for a little while in intellectual property business development. And then I moved on to software business unit doing analytics software for the telcos, and then progressed to leading a team on innovation and strategy within that analytics software business. So that was my last role in corporate, and I've since left corporate and working on my own.
Yeah, and if I may, your consulting business has a interesting name. It's called Octopus Innovation. We can see our mascot in the background. It's super cute. I'd love to dig into that and understand the reasoning behind having a name like that.
Sure. So for one, I've always been active in the aquarium hobby. So I'm always fascinated by aquatic creatures, both freshwater and saltwater.
Yeah.
Although in terms of hobby, I've only kept freshwater aquariums. But the octopus is a creature that really fascinates me because of its ability to solve mazes. It can put it in a very tight space and it's able to find that little opening and squeeze out of it.
Yeah.
There's also been sign that it's able to use tools. Like if it sees a coconut shell on the bottom of the ocean floor, it can use it to make it a shelter or do something else with it. And it's also got sensory, nerves all along its tentacles. So it's a brain system that's not centralized. It's like a distributed network. So for all those reasons, I find that the octopus really represents, innovation, creativity, and that's why I picked it for the business name.
Yeah, I'm pretty fascinated by octopus too. I've seen a few documentaries and you're right. It's one of the most intelligent creatures. It's quite adaptable. It's able to use tools and figure out ways. And I think that's a representation of how your consulting business works, right? You are adaptable for whatever businesses' needs are, and you're able to provide them solutions tailored to whatever their budgets are or whatever their bandwidth is. So very interesting name, and thanks for sharing the story behind that. I also come from a telco background, so I started my career writing code for the Motor Razr phone, which was a rage back in mid-2000s, and I wrote the camera and camcorder code for it. And those were the days we would talk with Motorola and Nokia, Siemens and Ericsson, and they were all doing compelling work in terms of building up smartphones. And smartphones was a big deal. I believe you had some background with Nokia as well. I'd love to hear a story from back in the day, something that really stuck with you and that has shaped you into who you are.
So one story I can share is from when I was still in graduate school. At that time, I was a master's student, and I still wasn't sure if I was going to continue on with a PhD. I remember vividly, one day I was down in the basement of the engineering building, and I was on my way to class or something, just standing by the elevator, and one of the professors stopped by waiting for the elevator, and it mentioned, hey, why don't you stop by my office sometime and talk about what the research is doing to see if it's interesting to me. And So I took him up on it. I talked to him, and then it led to me joining his research group. And
Yes.
then, he became my PhD advisor.
Yeah.
And so, if I hadn't bumped into him that day at the elevator and
Mm,
agreed to
mm,
talk to him further, uh,
mm.
my career might have taken a different
Taking
path.
it. Yeah.
The one thing that I remind myself to always be observant and look around,
Mm,
because you never know when opportunity might arise. And
mm.
sometimes even insignificant events could lead to something bigger. So it's easy looking back because
Mm,
hindsight is always 2020. But
mm.
looking forward, you never know which of these encounters are going to lead to
Yeah.
something down the line.
That's amazing. I resonate with what you're saying because I am also a strong believer in always keeping an open eye for opportunities because you never know which opportunity could land you where. There's been enough instances in my personal life too. I also believe destiny has a role to play in how our lives unfold. Sometimes it's good to go with the flow because you'll be surprised where life takes you and what opportunities come knocking at your door, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I like jazz. Jazz music,
Yeah.
it's all about improvisation. And when you observe a jazz band playing together, they're always listening to the other players and
Mm,
taking cues. So it's
mm.
not like classical music where you're following the score exactly. Jazz is all about improvising and going with the flow, like you said. In the end, it all sounds good. It comes together.
Yeah, there is beauty in that. There's beauty in knowing that not every piece is planned. And sometimes it's just what comes naturally and organic.
And that's how creativity works, because to be creative, you have to be open to looking at, different ideas and
Mm,
connecting the dots and combining different ideas, because it sparks new things. And,
correct.
as a researcher at heart, I'm always looking for different ways to do things.
Yeah, there might be creative ways of solving the same problem. So once you let your creative juices flow, and with the AI coming in, we've opened the Pandora box. There's so
Yeah.
many different
And it
avenues.
applies to the career path also. It's not a linear path. You have many options to just choose from. Like you said, if you allow yourself to be open to take risks and explore different opportunities, you never know where that might lead you.
Correct. Correct. Fantastic. Hock, we're all in this era where I see a lot of people that are probably on the older side that are overwhelmed with AI and they have absolutely no idea where to even get started. And maybe they've used ChatGPT, but they prefer the old school ways. So there's that segment of the society, and there's the other segment, which is pretty well versed with AI because they've seen it over the last few years and they've used it in some shape or form, but they still are overwhelmed because there's so many options out there. And even to do the smallest task, they could possibly go and find at least 3 or 4 agents. So if you could help break down for both those segments of the society, how do they go about it? I believe I'm in the second segment where I pretty well versed, but I'd love to understand what are some of the must-haves, and for somebody who has absolutely no idea, how do they get started?
Yeah. So I'll address the group that's new first. So if you've heard so much about AI, my advice is just get on it and use the tool daily. So pick one. Let's say if you're going to pick ChatGPT, stick with it for 30 days, 60 days, make it a point to use it daily and talk to it so that you can understand, the nuances of how an AI would respond to you and how it works. It could be any tool. It could be Claude, could be Gemini. Just pick one and stick with it. I would also say learn as much as you can, because there's so much free resources out there, right? There's LinkedIn, there's YouTube, there's tutorials out there. For those who are a little bit more experienced, I would say it's a, a trade-off between time and money.
Yeah.
So there's a model of DIY, do it yourself. You can go and get the tool and try it and learn it. That's going to take you time. The second model is, if you don't have as much time, but you have budget, then hire someone to guide you through it, because what that allows you to do is leapfrog the learning curve.
Yeah.
It's depending on your resources, your needs. That's a trade-off that you have to consider,
Yeah.
whether you want to go the DIY route or the do it for you or do it with you route. there's always lots of resources and people out there who are available to help.
Yeah. Great. And yeah, I was talking to my dad and he was like, what is ChatGPT? And I was like, Dad, think of
Okay.
ChatGPT as like your personal assistant who's just inside a computer. And
Yeah.
whatever questions you have, you can
Right.
ask it and it will give you a response. And he texted me and he was like, it's got reasonable response. I'm like, I told you, don't be scared of it.
And one more thing for people who are new and you want to try it out, one of the ways that's frictionless to use it is download the ChatGPT app on your phone and use voice mode because you can just talk to it
Talk to it.
and the responses are very natural sounding now.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not robotic. It sounds like you're talking to a person.
Yeah.
So it's like when I'm driving, I just turn it on
Yeah.
and I would just talk to it and ask it questions
Yeah.
because at the end, I'll have that transcript. I could go back and look at it, the things that we spoke about.
Yeah.
What are some of the ideas?
Yeah. And it also saves your context. So I was explaining this to my dad when he was like, it remembered what I asked it yesterday. And I was like, yeah, that's the beauty of it. It's profiling you in a way that it tries to understand you like another person would. So you don't have to repeat yourself.
Yeah.
Just assume that it knows because you asked that question yesterday and you can build on top of it. So it has that context and that background. All right, Hock. I wanted to talk to you about your experience working with AI tools. You've gotten your hands dirty with pretty much all possible tools out. So where do you think we stand today in terms of how good they are versus what their marketing material says?
Yes, there are two main categories. You have the purpose-built tools, which are specific for an application, copywriting for marketers, for example. And then you have the more general purpose LLMs. So you have ChatGPT, Claude, and so on. And then maybe a third category are these middleware platforms that allow you to create custom applications, custom AI applications. And in the back end, it's calling the APIs of the various tool providers. So those are be the three main categories. One area I'm really interested in is image and video generation with AI. Of course, there's the king image generators, Midjourney, and I think in terms of aesthetics, Midjourney is still the best out there. There are some other open source models that are catching up. And then video generators, so many now coming up. And it's good to see the progress, but I think there's still much more work to be done because in terms of controllability of the output to generate the scenes that you have in mind, there's still quite a bit of trial and error to get to the output that you want. And the second area that I see progress to be made is in terms of the user experience or the user interface of some of these tools. So I know up to this point, a lot of the focus is on the technology behind it, but we're at a stage now where the user experience is really important, especially if we want to bring in more users onto the platform.
I love how you categorize them. And I mean, I use ChatGPT and Dolly and Midjourney and played around with the Claude and now DeepSeek as well. But on the image side, one of the observations I have made, which is from testing it out for the last few months, is if you want an AI to create a brand new image with text on it, it hasn't generated results where I am blown away and say, oh, this is perfect.
Right.
Something as simple as my kid's birthday party invite, which I wanted in the form of a poster.
Yeah.
And I was like, here's all the text and I want this image, create a nice, bright image. And it struggled with it. And I tried it a few times and I tried multiple different platforms. And I'd love to understand if you've had that experience too, because I was not expecting it to generate a less than average result, but it did. Image generation with text overlay on it, with just the text you want it to have. What I've experienced it, they will create those nice images, they will have some of that text, but they'll have additional text because it's pulling images from the internet somewhere.
Right.
And it's not able to remove that text from it and only have the text I want on it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are the general models that are trained more on the images, and then there are models where it's been customized towards better text generation. So the piece of advice I would say is pick the right tool for the right job. And sometimes we cannot expect one tool to be able to do everything.
Everything.
So one popular tool out there is ideogram is good at
Yes.
text generation,
Yes.
whereas Midjourney is not as good. Um,
Correct.
if you want great image aesthetics, you could always take the output that you've generated from Midjourney, feed it into
Feed it
Canva,
into
and
that.
then
Yeah.
create your text in Canva or some other editing process. The second thing I wanted to say is that there's also been more progress on the AI image editing side, not just the AI image creation. So with Midjourney, for instance, now you have the ability to edit portions of the image and regenerate just those portions.
Ah, nice.
So if something's, if you want to have some object replaced in your image and keep the rest the same, with image editing within the tool now, you can do that.
Oh,
And
interesting.
that goes for text as well.
Nice. I could hypothetically circle out that unwanted text from the image and say, remove that and blend it with the rest of the image. Good to know. And yes, I've used ideogram. You were the one that told me about ideogram, and it actually did generate much better results than the others. But it sounds like tools has its own niche. So Midjourney can create
Right.
stellar images, but when you want to create an image with text overlay or some sort of poster,
Right.
then you go to something like ideogram or use images from Midjourney, did into ideogram, or even Dolly for that matter. I think Dolly has done a decent job of creating that. But right now, there is no one tool who can take a prompt and generate an image with whatever text or no text perfectly, right? There's still work needs to be done to get to that level.
Right. You could create a custom tool that's able to output the final Instagram story or LinkedIn carousel, starting from just a prompt.
Yeah.
I haven't really seen a good tool yet that can do all that.
Yeah.
But in principle, it's possible with the technology that we have today.
Right. The buzz is all about DeepSeek. I've gotten my hands dirty and I was quite impressed, especially the kind of behind the scene thought process that it lays out for you, which is exactly like how an analytical human being would go about solving a problem. I'd love your thoughts on it. What you thought was great and what you thought was work that still needed to be done for DeepSeek.
Yeah. Like you said, I do like that transparent thinking process that it has, because it mimics the way a human would think through the problem. So when you're trying to learn a new subject or area and you're trying to learn how an expert in that area would think through a problem, being able to see that thought process rather than just getting the output would be very beneficial.
Correct.
There are a couple of things which are drawbacks for DeepSeek. One is that their privacy policies allow for chats to be used in training their model. So I would have liked to see a way for us to opt out of using our inputs for training the model. Having said that, because it's open source, you can actually download the model onto your computer. So I've done that with Olama. You can use Olama in combination with Web UI and create an interface, right? Just like GPT, and select the DeepSeek model and run it. If you have enough storage and RAM and so on, because if you go to Hugging Face, you can all the models are there.
Yes, I see Hugging Face is going all out for open source, and they should. That's their philosophy.
Yeah, and there's various quantized models there. If you have the machine that's able to do it locally, you can download the biggest model and try it out locally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's opened the doors for so many different people to use that on their own local machines if they have the CPU configuration, and then build out new ways to use AI for different use cases. And that brings me to my next question. I mean, there are some standard use cases that we're all aware of, like image generation and assistant. But other than that, I'd love to understand what possible use case can be explored with the use of AI now that maybe people haven't really thought through.
Yeah, what's coming in the future is hyper customization. Anyone will be able to create applications that are purpose built for your needs. So tools like Cursor, it's able to code for you. So the value is not so much in knowing how to write code. The value really is in creativity and thinking of new ways to solve problems. These AI tools allow you to converse with it in plain English or any language for that matter, because AI is able to do real-time translation now. You're not kind of locked towards general purpose applications like a Microsoft Word or an Excel, where the feature space is so large, but what you need of it is really a very small portion of the totality of the features. But sometimes you also need something to work, which is not available in that software. So whatever it is, have to customize to your own personal needs. You'll be able to have AI create that.
Yeah, the possibilities are limitless. You can think of an idea and you can quickly test it out. Because you have these AI tools, which are like your team of software engineers and designers, that you can just provide those instructions and test out your theory and see how functional it is. And that gives us all so much power to do so much more. And I think it's not too futuristic to think of using AI in our households. We have self-driving cars already today, but pretty much every gadget in our house would be AI equipped in a way that you could talk to it, or you could have a robot folding your laundry. And that's not something that's too far-fetched anymore. That should happen, hopefully, soon. But I thinking at a more broader level, I feel that companies today haven't explored the use of AI in solving big problems that humanity overall is struggling with.
Right.
And obviously, it'll take a lot more effort, and not just organizations, but governments and United Nations to come together. But if AI could be used to solve problems, like if we could have protected the LA fires in some way, where you have systems that check and start sprinkler systems in houses, so you put down that fire fast, or be able to not just inform people that an earthquake is coming, but also find ways that it create least amount of damage. And I'm just thinking out loud here, but those bigger causes are really important for all of us as humans to start thinking of how we can use this powerful tool to broaden the way we've all been living and help humanity overall.
I also think that the social aspect is something that needs to be addressed, especially isolation. Social media has already created a lot of isolation, and AI could push that even further. If you're so used to just communicating with AI that you've lost the ability to work together with other people, losing the art of interacting with people and all the soft skills that come with it. We need to keep an eye on it to make sure that we're not losing sight of the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And those are things that make us uniquely human, like our creative side and our social aspects, the way we talk, the way we connect, the way we build friendships and relationships. We should let AI do the menial work. Do our chores for us, but we should continue to do the art and the relationship building, because we thrive on it. If we continue to use the machines for that, then it'll be a sad world. I don't think we should progress that way. So
the other thing I'm concerned about is what role it plays in education, and at what point do you introduce technology into education? You still need to teach all those critical thinking skills. And where is that boundary where you start introducing technology to the kids?
Yeah. As a mom of a tween, we have this conversation on a daily basis, because on one hand, yes, AI can help them excel in whatever they want to do. But at the same time, I agree with your point that as kids, we want them to build those skills to a point where they can then use AI to enhance. But until that point, we shouldn't have AI disrupt education. It should enhance education, where it can take on roles like being a tutor to kids and helping them understand at a personalized level why they are doing well or not doing well for a certain subject. But AI is handed over to kids to use it like a calculator, then can be misused, and kids may not want to develop those core skills, reasoning skills and problem solving and analytical skills. We want them to develop to the point where they are 16 or 17, and then they use these tools to do whatever they want to do, versus if you just give it to them and let them go wild with it.
Because it's a very different technological leap. It's basically replacing your ability to think.
Exactly.
You need to be able to think and not just rely on a machine to do that.
Exactly. And also, humans tend to become lazy when they have technology to do things for them. Handing AI tools to kids at a very young age
Right.
could be harmful because it'll make them lazy, where they would not want to build some of those core skills that are important. So thinking is such a
Right.
core skill. Problem solving, being creative. They'll rely on these AI tools for everything, and it'll make the next generation dumb. So we have to be careful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
An AI model training your kids as a tutor, sometimes they might make things up. And as a child, it will be very hard for you to distinguish between what part of it is hallucination or what part of it is inaccurate, because
Right.
you're trained to accept everything on the face value. And especially if your tutor is telling you something, right? And so I wanted to bring that up because I thought that was an interesting twist. I'm seeing that there are platforms like Galileo and others that are scoring response based on, oh, this is 70% accurate and this is 85% accurate. But we should be all aware that not all responses are 100% accurate. So there is some iota of fiction going in the response too.
The other thing is that even with web search capability that most of these LLMs have now, it's still opaque in terms of which websites they will rely on to draw the information from. Because it will give you citations of 6 or 8 websites that it gathers information from.
Yeah.
But how do you know what's the quality of the information on those sites?
Yeah. And how true. So Perplexity does that, right? Perplexity gives you the sources. And that's a great point. Even though they give you the sources, how accurate are those sources is another question that needs to be understood.
Yeah, it's very much like, search engine optimization. You have an algorithm that determines how well a page is ranked and what's the authority of the page.
Yeah.
But I feel that we're lacking that on the LLM side in terms of how they're pulling these references. It would be nice to have some transparency on how they're actually deciding, which are the authority websites.
Like which website has more weights than the others and how reliable they are. If you are in research, you want to know where is my source of truth coming from, exactly which websites, which sources, right?
And that's where the custom applications come in, because if you're a company working in an industry segment, let's say, you're an insurance company, and you know the list of reliable resources, what websites pull from.
Yeah.
So you can always build something that's, customized towards your industry segment that will only look at those trusted sources that you specify.
Yeah. Let's say ChatGPT provides a enterprise license to an insurance company. They should be allowed to then customize and say, do not give me results from these websites, which are blacklisted for whatever reason, and prioritize these other resources or websites. I'm taking an example of a couple of years back at the time of Corona, when we were all so confused with all kinds of information coming in, and CDC was probably the source of truth, because anything that the CDC would declare would be well understood and trusted, but everything else was sheer rumor. Coming back to this AI conversation, if you have some of those trusted sources that you can 100% rely on, and then everything else cut out. So I'm hoping that's something that's available in the enterprise license. Obviously, I haven't tried the enterprise license yet, but it'll be interesting. Other than hallucination, I also feel user data security and privacy is another thing that savvy users should be aware of, because while we are putting in all of our data, we have to be careful because it's going to get used for training their models, and you don't want your data compromised. So use it selectively.
Right.
One of the things that I think are very important for all of us to understand, especially for people that are fairly new to AI, is the concept of hallucination in AI. And what I mean by that is, because AI is based on these large language models that are combining and combing through tons and tons of data all over the internet, it tries to make sense out of every question it's being asked, but sometimes it may not have a solid answer to the question because of what data it's been trained on. And in those cases, AI would make up a response because it's been programmed to provide a response. And while we know that a lot of models have been stating this very honestly on the chat platforms, we also know that there is plenty of hallucination. I want to get your thoughts on what you have seen and where do you think users can address it?
Yeah, so definitely hallucinations will happen. And there are a couple of ways to get around it. I think you should always check the source of the information, especially when it's critical. If you're using an LLM, let's say, that does web search, you can always ask it to state the source of the information that it gathered from. The other way is by prompt engineering. You explicitly tell it to not make up information. So saying something like, if you don't find the information, do not make it up. Another thing I've tried is after it has given you the response, you can follow up saying, can you please verify the information? And sometimes I've seen it go back and correct itself and say, I'm sorry, this information was incorrect. Upon
Correct.
further research, I found the right answer.
Yeah.
Uh, so those are a couple of ways for personal use. But in terms of business use, enterprise use, then I would resort to something like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where you are uploading your private information so that it's available to the LLM for searching
Trading.
through, for training. Exactly.
Got it.
And that way it will be able to access that knowledge base that is available.
And use that as a source of truth for somebody else if they are inquiring about the same information. Great pointers there. So if the accuracy of the information that you're trying to receive from the LLM is important, then you, one, provide that in the prompt and tell it to not make up information, and also provide you the sources, right? You said you provide the sources from where they have validated, and you can also ask it to refrain from certain websites which may not report accurate website, because there might be random stuff on the internet which can be perceived as true because it is somewhere on some website and the LLM will not know if it's accurate or not. Asking it to keep its search restrained to whatever sources you trust is another good way. And then RAG is obviously a good way, but I know that a lot of enterprises are worried about their privacy and where is the data hosted and how is their private information being used. They might lose their competitive advantage. So we can get into that, but those were some really good pointers for users. Dialing down on this more, I wanted to ask you, for the last 2 decades now, we're reliant on Google search, and that has changed recently, at least from my inner group. I know we are not Googling things anymore because it would return to you a bunch of different sources. And then you have to do the due diligence of figuring out what your information is and what's the final source of truth. Gemini has kind of done some summary, but I wanted to understand your perspective on the native Google search. Where do you think that is going to proceed in the next couple of years or even months as we become more intelligent with these AI language models like ChatGPT, Claude, DeepSeek, and
that's definitely an interesting question, and we'll see more changes as user adoption of these LLMs increase. So right now, I'm not sure what the user penetration is for, let's say, ChatGPT on the phone. How many users are actually using that as their default go-to app when they need to search for information? But I think increasingly, as it becomes more popular, people will start going to ChatGPT first before actually going to a Google search, right? And so I think that will definitely impact the entire advertising industry, as well as on the other side, right? The whole industry of search engine optimization.
Correct. Exactly.
Now you have to ask the question about how the LLMs are actually coming up with the result that it shows you.
And I understand that not everyone has the same user behavior. Maybe we are early adopters of AI in the sense that we're asking questions to the language model because we're curious to test them out too. But you brought up a good point, and I was curious about this over the weekend. One is the search engine optimization. The other is the entire ads business that all of these giants are running on. If everyone is so focused on open source for the AI models and there are no ads there, which is a good advantage for users because you don't want to see a bunch of ads, how does that lead to these companies building out businesses? Of course, they can have enterprise licenses, but it also begs the question on innovative ways of doing business. Like when Facebook and Google first came out, obviously they hadn't thought through the ads platform the way it is now. Users are pretty vocal about the fact that they're inundated with enough ads and they care about their privacy and they don't want these big giant companies to spy on every piece of conversation and everything they're thinking through. The LLMs will need to find a smarter way of making money if everything is open source, right? Any thoughts on that? Curious to see how things will evolve.
Well, with regards to the LLM, their model is not ad-based because they have another source of revenue, which is from enterprise users or just everyday users at different levels of subscription.
Yeah.
So I think the big question is when you type a query or a prompt,
Mm.
how does it gather that information? Because there's no page rank algorithm
Mm.
that surfaces that top result, just
Correct.
like in a Google search.
Correct.
So if I open up ChatGPT, for instance, and say,
Mm.
look for Italian restaurants near me,
Mm.
which websites would it go to look for that information first? And how
Mm.
does it decide?
Mm.
And as you mentioned, even if there's no advertising available, I
Mm.
think the main question is really on distribution. The
Mm.
reason Google is popular is because it has a wide distribution.
Mm.
Everyone who wants to search for something would
Yeah.
go to Google first,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
But now we're seeing a more fragmented
Mm.
environment,
Yeah.
also generational differences.
Correct.
Like, Gen Zs and Gen Alphas,
Even
they would
millennials.
probably, even millennial, yeah,
Um,
they might go first to social media
mm.
before hitting Google search,
Mm.
and they're getting a lot of
Yeah.
that that
You
information.
answers. Correct.
So the distribution, where you're getting eyeballs from,
Mm.
could be from a social platform.
Mm.
And so companies would have to look at the impact and,
Mm.
how to reach the end users
Yeah.
apart from just the traditional
Yeah.
search
Yeah.
results.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we have seen that some companies, and I'll take OpenAI as example, like ChatGPT, will provide you, like to your question about what are good Italian restaurants around me, they will tell you some of the sources where this, like they would say
Exactly.
TripAdvisor and Yelp and
Right.
Google reviews and things like that,
Right.
right? And then they'll provide that,
Right.
whatever, 5, 6 sources, and that's good information. But a
Right.
big part of the response that AI gets us today
Mhm.
is still what we understand as the concept of the black box, where we don't know what goes behind. So you said
Mhm.
we don't know which page was ranked,
Right.
which which source of information did it add the most weight on, and
Right.
there is no transparency around that one solid response it gives us, right?
Mhm.
And that's always been a question that I'm sure Google and other companies are also constantly questioning about, because from an ethical standpoint, Google's always been like, here's all the source of information and you be the
Right.
judge and you decide what's
Right.
relevant for you. And that was the source of their business for the longest time. The LLM models have taken that one step further and distilled it
Right.
into one
Right.
concise information. And we spoke about hallucination. There are so
Mhm.
much biases in the data. So there's bias that plays a role. There's hallucination that AI is making up stuff. We don't know how it's ranking stuff. So it's not transparent. And
Mhm.
I think that's something that for the everyday user may be fine. But
Right.
if you're working on something where security is a big aspect of your job, or
Mhm.
privacy, data privacy is super important,
Mhm.
relying on those LLMs becomes even more tough, because you
Right.
have to rely on the accuracy of the data being responded to,
Right.
and you want it to be most accurate. So I wanted to
Right.
get your take on this and understand, where do you see these LLMs being able to handle this black block
Yeah.
black box problem? Yeah.
Right.
Which ones
Well,
have been better than the others?
I think in general, you'll never get to peek inside the black box for any LLM. And the reason
Mhm.
I say that is because we're looking at models now that have billions of parameters. So it's almost impossible to have an explanation how it arrived at a particular answer,
Mhm.
because there's just so many permutations when you have billions of parameters. But if you think a little bit further back, when in machine learning days, when they were trying to figure out like which pictures are cats and which are not cats, right?
Mhm.
Using neural networks.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
there you get some explainability by looking at the slices in the middle steps,
Yeah,
because it reveals some of the features of cats, like,
yeah,
if it has pointy ears and,
yeah,
2 eyes and,
yeah,
the tail and so on.
yeah.
Um, but now we've gone so far beyond,
Beyond it. Yeah,
that in terms
yeah.
of the number of parameters, that I
Correct.
don't think you'll ever get at an explainable type of,
Response. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
response.
Yeah. Which is good and bad if I really simplify it. While the LLMs have become even more sophisticated in the way they are doing things, Identifying a cat, for example, or identifying a grandma. I mean, that was another example. I don't know if you've heard of that example, which became a social rage because if you asked Google, give me a picture of a grandma, 90% of the responses were a white grandma because Google was only fed pictures of grandma which were
Right.
Caucasian for that matter.
Yeah.
But people were like, no, their grandmas could be of
Right.
any
Yeah.
background, any color and all that. But anyways, coming back to your point, because of the complexity in the way billions of parameters are being used, it's very complex. But at the same time, it also makes this even more important because there definitely is biases in the data, which is a big problem. There's also AI trying to make up stuff. And while
Right.
you can prompt that, I don't know if we can conclusively say that you can rely on that data 100%. Right? Time will tell as these models get complex and how they are able to solve this problem of the black box. And it's relevant to both open source and closed source, whether it's DeepSeek or OpenAI or Claude. All of them are sophisticated enough where I'm sure they're not able to tell you with 100% accuracy that this response is totally accurate and does not have any biases in the data.
Yeah, but one direction where we see things going, or like DeepSeek, it explains the steps that it's taking. And even with OpenAI now, with the deep search, it will show you what are the steps that it's thinking through. So at least at that level, there is some transparency into how it's going about coming up with the final response. So it does give you a little bit of visibility into the thought process.
The thought process. Correct.
Yeah. And there are certain fields where it's more important, right? If we think about medical diagnosis, then it's very important to be able to understand how it arrived at the final answer.
Right. Because the wrong diagnosis could have fatal impacts if viewed by practitioners.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. We spoke about DeepSeek, but we also wanted to talk about Quen, which is the new model from Alibaba. And I wanted to see if you were able to try it out and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I was able to run some prompts through Quen. So that I'm referring to the latest model that they have, which is the 2.5 Max. That one is actually not open source yet. You can find Quen 2.5 open source, but the Max model is not. The part where I find it's actually quite capable is in language translation. So I was able to give it an English passage or a short couple of sentences and ask it to translate to Malay, which I'm fluent in, having gone through school entirely in the language. And it was able to capture the nuances of certain words, giving you explanation to say that, okay, you would use this word for this context, but another word for a different context, even though the English word is one word. So it's able to do that. Whereas if I try the same prompt on some of the other models, it doesn't give you as much of that nuance and explanation. So I think it does do better for language translation because it's trained on much more data from other languages. Which is, if you look at their documentation, that is what they say, that language translation is one of the things that they excel.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I'll give it a try. I haven't tried it yet. What you told me got me thinking to another experiment that I had done with AI a couple months back. But coming back to English and AI's inability to understand the human psyche, human context behind a few things, right? So we live in America and we've all heard the term "get out of here," right? And we know that it means totally different things given the context.
Right.
Somebody is mad at you and we're having a heated conversation, get out of here could mean literally get out of here, I'm upset.
Yeah.
While if you're talking with your friends and you told them something which they don't believe, they're like, get out of here. Right? Totally different context for this exact same words, right? And I was wondering if I has gotten to that level where it can understand the tonality of these human behaviors and understand the context and be able to relate and say, oh, the same thing could mean totally different things. And in other languages too, you can have the same thing mean totally different depending on the context that you're talking about. I wanted to see if you've experimented with this at all.
No, I've not. In terms of context, if it's a written paragraph where that sentence appears, I'm sure it can derive from what comes before and after it, what the meaning of it is. But I think with these multimodal models now that you have, which is able to look at audio and video inputs as well. I think that's certainly, something that can be done. Understanding of the tone, intonation, and so on.
Yeah. And deriving what something truly means in the context of those things. Because, I feel like there's so much more that we should look forward to with AI. And we've already seen such a huge jump from how it used to be a couple years back to what it is now. So it's exciting times.
And also, I think in terms of language, to be able to have instantaneous translation. So if I'm speaking to someone else who's speaking another language, to be able to hear in real time what they're saying in a different language. And I hope that we'll get there soon. That will open up, a lot of conversations with people who don't speak English as their first language.
The obvious use case I can think of is in terms of translation between people from different parts of the world. Could you think of some other use cases where this would be?
Yeah, actually, I was talking to someone else over the weekend, and it came up like they were talking about like dating websites. For instance, you could have two people from two completely different cultures falling in love, and they don't speak the language.
Same language.
And if you have instantaneous translation, that's going to open up new possibilities.
Thinking out loud in terms of how enterprises, when they are trying to scale into a different market in a different region, like a lot of times traditionally people would need a local office with people speaking the local language to really build a consumer base. If you have a consumer product, you want a local office because that's what people trust. And I understand that that's not going to change drastically, but being able to use tech to be able to translate your vision and your thoughts to somebody, whether it's dating or expanding in a different market, I think it just opens so many doors for all of us to think of different ways of doing business and not be so siloed in where we are and who we should serve. The world is the oyster now.
Another interesting thing about languages, which I've tested, if you look at image generation models like Midjourney, they are actually trained on images that are labeled with different languages as well. If you go on Midjourney and you ask it to generate something and you give it a foreign word, sometimes it can generate that image. So if you give it the Spanish word for elephant, for example, and give it nothing else, you'll still get picture of the elephant.
Get picture of elephant. Interesting. That begs a question that I was actually talking to somebody a couple of weeks back. While there is a lot of data that is labeled, and so the models are able to train on that, I think there is a huge amount of data that is not labeled, that is being used to train these models. And part of it is causing the problem, I believe, because the models don't know necessarily how to categorize it because it's not labeled. And I don't know if this is some form of, supervised learning versus unsupervised learning in terms of training. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, because from what I gathered, the bigger amount of data is unlabeled. And I don't know if there are any creative ways these companies are figuring out to find some sort of categorization to that data. Maybe, to your point, they are labeled, but they're not labeled in English. But now with language translation, whatever the label is, whatever language, doesn't matter. But if it's absolutely not labeled, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in order to be labeled, it would have to be described by a human.
By a human,
some form of a language description. And one way I can think of them doing that is by taking, let's say, YouTube videos, because people are talking, there's a transcript that's associated with it. So you can actually match up the transcript and what's going on in the videos and the images. But like you said, there's so much more video data available, like think about all those surveillance cameras all over the world, right? That's recording, 24 hours a day,
24/7,
but
and
there's no labeling of the images. So that data is there, but it's very difficult for someone to go back and create labels.
And then I think that's the bigger task for a lot of these companies, to be able to find creative ways to still use all of that data. And get to a point where it's labeled to some shape or form, right? Great, Hock. So one interesting observation when comparing these different tools was, I mean, during the inauguration time, there was this famous picture of the billionaires all standing together, Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. And I think it was you who sort of used that image and pulled it into multiple different models to test out which one of them would recognize their images, like recognize the face and tell you exactly who they are. And I believe for the most part, none of them were able to except for one. So tell us a little bit about it and tell us how some models were able to identify and others were not.
Sure. So I wanted to test out the multimodal capability because a lot of these LLMs now can process images, audio, multiple modes input.
Yeah.
And so I took that image that you've seen a lot in
the billionaire show. Yeah.
Right. The billionaires standing in a row.
Yeah.
And I fed it to Claude, to Gemini, and to Grok. And out of these four, Grok was the only model that could give me names of the people that it identified from that image. So there are guardrails built into some of these other models.
Yeah.
Guardrails that say, do not identify faces of people in an image, for instance. And those guardrails will depend on the company that's providing that LLM. Because if you remember in the early days, Gemini was able to create images, and then there was some PR issue because of the mix of images that it created, and that it shut off that capability at some point and did not allow people to use it.
Yeah, and I see the reason for having those guardrails, and probably Grok hasn't implemented those guardrails, but maybe they will. But in an open source, like I don't think you did that for DeepSeek. You can't have those guardrails in an open source, or you still can?
You still can if there's a way for the configuration of the LLM to be specified.
Right.
Yeah. So again, it would depend on the amount of training information that it has.
Okay.
So it would do better at public figures where there are a lot of images that are already labeled with their names that it can learn from.
Yeah. And this brings to an important point that a lot of people have also raised concerns over so many years that AI could lead to a lot of cybercrime as well, because it could impersonate a person by their audio or use their imagery for creating all kinds of frauds. And that's why it's important to have these guardrails in place. So many things are possible. So how people use AI, it could be, both in a positive way and also in a negative way. And it'll be important for these big companies to make sure that there are enough protections and guardrails and security in place that misuse of that information is minimized.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but, we really need public awareness by public knowing what are the capabilities of the technology so that they're aware what are the things to look out for. It's just like, in terms of the scams that we're getting in email, we're so much more aware of it today than, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. It was so much easier for, the bad guys to do phishing emails and get us to click on links.
Correct. Yeah, but it's also, the systems are getting so much smarter that it's also becoming really hard to distinguish a scam from a genuine call, right? And like the voice, I heard some stories where they were able to record somebody's voice and sort of use that same voice module to send a voice message or voice memo, which was so identical to their family member, and they thought they were in crisis. But it's important for people in today's day and age to understand that all of these things are also part and parcel of a new technology, and we have to be aware and do the due diligence of checking everything before reacting to certain things.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice to follow.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much, Hock. Super helpful, and excited to see how things will pan out, and maybe we'll do another session.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your insights, and I am excited for how AI will shape our future, and we can all be more productive and work like for people.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Shuchi. It was really good. Yeah.
Thanks for joining. Thank you for your time. Good speaking with you.